I am very excited. Thank you very much for inviting me to moderate this panel with three fabulous people on addressing the crisis on the US-Mexico border. So we have Ana Minian, and we have Ben Hueso, and then we have Ambassador Carlos González. Sorry for the pronunciation. I think that it's Gutiérrez.
Yes, yes.
There you go. So Ana is my wonderful colleague here at the history department. She is a professor of history. She received recently the Andrew Carnegie Fellowship for Exceptional Scholars, Journalists, and Public Intellectuals. Her award-winning first book, Undocumented Lives, is something that everybody who is interested in immigration and in especially the immigration from Mexico to the US must read. And I cannot wait to the second book. You know, how is your dissertation going, Anna, with the second book? I hear it's coming along well. I can't wait to read it, No Man's Land, A New History of Immigration Restriction. We also have Ben Hueso, who is really serving in office for, like, I think a couple decades already in various positions. Right now serving as a council member with the California Delta Stewardship Council, was a member of the California State Senate for about a decade, since 2013 to 2022, was the chair of the California Latino Legislative Caucus, president of the San Diego City Council, served as a member of Tijuana's Border Affairs Committee, so know a thing or two about the situation there in the Mexico border. And then we have Ambassador Carlos, the Consul General of Mexico in San Diego since 2019, a real expert on Mexico community in the U.S. Since the mid-80s, I would say. The founding executive director of the Institute of Mexicans Abroad, the agency in charge of promoting ties and collaboration between Mexico and its diaspora. So we have a really wonderful panel today. I realize I didn't introduce myself. I am Ran Abramitzky. I am the professor here at the economics department and the senior associate dean for the social sciences at Stanford. And most importantly, in this forum, I'm a senior fellow at CIPER. And then the way we thought of doing it is, I will just, I will give before we zoom in on the crisis in the US-Mexico border, I want to give a very brief historical perspective on immigration in the US and address two misconceptions. Then I thought, each of the panelists will have like 10 minutes and they will speak, and then we'll have a little bit of a discussion. But I realize that this is a topic that many people have questions and about. So we would love to have discussions so you can think about already about the questions that you wanna ask. And these are basically what I'm showing you. They are based on my recent book with my long-term collaborator and friend, Leah Bustan from Princeton, a book that aims to bring data and long-term perspective on the immigration debate, which is often based on fear and on anecdotes rather than on evidence and facts. And the first misconception I want to address is that we are in the midst of an unprecedented flood of immigrants today. So the first point, I guess, is that we are not really in the midst of an unprecedented flood. Today, there are about 45 million people in the US who were born in another country. So about 1 in 7 residents, so about 14% of the US population. Now, is this the highest share of immigrants in the population, in the US population ever? The answer is no. During the age of mass migration between 1850 and 1914, immigrants accounted for 14% of the US population for 50 years. And then in the 1920s, this period of open border came to an end, first with a literacy test for entry to the US in 1917, followed by strict country-specific quotas that heavily favored immigrants from Northern and Western Europe over immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Then in the interwar period, we see little migration, with some important exceptions like individuals displaced by World War II, the Bracero program, and so on. But by and large, we see little migration, and immigration remained low all the way until the 1960s, where immigrants became around 5% of the US population. Then the Immigration and Nationality Act, 1965, which came at the midst of the civil rights movement, abolished these quotas based on country of origin and increased immigration quotas substantially, today to something like 675,000 immigrant visas per year. But of course, the demand for immigration is larger than the supply of visas, and this gave rise to millions of undocumented immigrants, which is a concept that did not really exist in the past because almost all immigrants were legally authorized to enter. And when you think about where are immigrants from, if you looked at the US in the 1850s and 1860s, 90% of immigrants were from Northern and Western Europe, the British Isles, Scandinavian countries, Germany, and so on. The remainder, around 10%, was from the rest of the world, which at the time mostly meant Canada. Then starting in the 1890s, immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe started to come in larger numbers, so that, from Russia, Italy, so that by the time the border closed in the 1920s, about 40% of the immigrant stock was from Southern and Eastern Europe. And then today, of course, Europe is no longer a main sending region of immigrants to the United States, and it is in fact mostly a receiving region of immigrants, and 75% of immigrants to the US come from Latin America, mainly Mexico, and from Asia. The second point I want to make, the second misconception is that immigrants come from poverty and remain poor. So the second point I want to make is that immigrant families are not stuck as a permanent underclass here in the United States. Instead, and this is work, by the way, that Leah and I did with two of our former students, now professors, Lisa Giacome and Santiago Perez. What we find is that the children of immigrants have always been very upwardly mobile, even when they grow up in poverty. In fact, especially when they grow up in poverty. And so, for example, consider what happens when we compare children raised in families with similarly low earnings. So let's focus today on children growing up at the 25th percentile of the income distribution. That would put you today at something like $31,000 per year. So think about it as the two spouses work for full-time for minimum wage jobs. And for the past, we use linked census data that we created, linking censuses over time and following individuals over time. For the present day, we use tax records from the Opportunity Insight or the General Social Surveys. And the figure that you see here shows how high in the income rank children growing up in poor families ended up reaching later in life. Okay, so this is for children born in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Why do we look at that cohort? Because we need enough time for these children to grow up and have a career of their own when we look at them today. And so, for example, the US-born children growing up at the 25th percentile of the income distribution ended up reaching to the 45th percentile when they grew up. That's the purple point over there. And every point here in the graph represents the immigrants from a different country for the 45 large countries around the world today. And so I guess two takeaways that I want you to take from this picture. The first striking takeaway is that as a group, the children of immigrants achieve more upward mobility than the children of US-born parents, reaching the 51st percentile on average as opposed to the 45th percentile. The second notable takeaway from this chart is that the children of poor immigrants from nearly every sending country are more upwardly mobile than the children of the US-born. So even children growing up to parents in very poor countries like Nigeria and Laos outperform the children of the US-born raised in similarly poor households. even children of immigrants from Central American countries like Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, that are often demonized for contributing to the crisis at the southern border, move up faster than the children of US born, landing in the middle of the pack right next to children growing up in poor households in Canada. And the third takeaway, and I'll stop here, is that this mobility advantage of the children of immigrants is just as strong today as it was in the past. So the children of immigrants from Mexico and the Dominican Republic today are just as upwardly mobile as the children of Swedes and Danes 100 years ago. And so this is all to say that the short-term perspective that politicians tend to take when they look at the next election cycle tend to undermine immigrant success. When you look at immigrants when they just arrive, there are, they are not very quickly moves from rags to riches, as the myth would suggest. Many of them end up working in in manual occupations for their entire life, but their children are doing very well. So when we take a long-term perspective, looking at past immigrant groups and at the children of immigrants, we find that the children of immigrants are doing remarkably well. So this is just to put this in a little bit broader historical context when we move to talk about the financial crisis, the crisis on the crisis, or you will tell me if it's a crisis on the Mexico border today. So I think I'll just stop here, and I'll call Anna to give us a presentation.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. Okay, so let me start by telling you the story of Alejandra Ramirez. Ramirez was a migrant who sought to come to the United States and hired smugglers to help her do so. The journey was, as she recalled years later, horrifying. They crossed about 7 people, and they made us walk for 3 days, she said. At one point, the migrants had to cross a river, but the current was so strong that it dragged one of them away. Still, the group had to continue. It did so for 2 more hours, when immigration officials saw the group and apprehended the migrants. Alejandra's story displays many of the features identified with crossing the US-Mexico border without papers, hiring coyotes, traversing through unknown territory, wading a dangerous river, and being caught and deported. But Ramirez's story did not take place in the US-Mexico boundary. It took place in the state of Veracruz, which is 330 miles away. Ramirez was a Guatemalan transmigrant, and the officials who caught her and then deported her belonged to Mexico's migratory services. Ramirez's experiences were not unique. Since the 1980s, the United States has pressured Mexican officials to convert their country into a buffer zone where Central Americans have been interdicted before they ever reached the US-Mexico border. This conference, of course, is about the US-Mexico border, but I argue that when it comes to migration, we can consider this border to extend much further south. So let me discuss how it was that the United States came to offshore migration control to Mexico and the implications that this has had. In the 1980s, civil wars erupted throughout Central America, and it led to thousands of people to flee north. It was in this moment that US policymakers decided that rather than try to only apprehend migrants here, they would try to make to convert Mexico into a border zone where migrants would be stopped and would not ever reach the US-Mexico border. But the question was, how could they convince Mexican officials to help? Well, US policymakers had a very strong bargaining chip, and that was Mexicans' own migration to the United States. Since the 1970s, the Mexican government had come to see the migration of its own citizens, even when it took place illegally, as beneficial to the country. US Secretary of State George Shultz used this information to persuade Mexican authorities to enter into a Faustian bargain. In 1983, he told Mexico's leaders that if Central Americans kept coming to the United States, the US government would further fortify the US-Mexico border. And this, of course, would not just stop Central Americans, but also Mexicans. Terrified at this prospect, Schultz's counterpart at the meeting replied that Mexican authorities would be willing to help solve the Central American refugee problem as best they could. Allowing the US to dictate its immigration policies, or who could enter and move through the country, meant that Mexico effectively lost its territorial sovereignty. And yet, it was willing to do so. After the meeting with Schultz, Mexico began policing Central Americans' routes north much more strongly. As time went on and US pressure continued on Mexico, the deportations of Central Americans in Mexico actually reached higher levels than the deportations of Central Americans by the United States. For instance, between 2002 and 2017, Mexico deported nearly 1.9 million Central Americans back to their home countries. 1.9. The United States, 1.1 million. Indeed, the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations continued to pressure Mexico's leaders to take responsibility for restricting Central American migration. So did, of course, the Trump administration. But it did so in a completely new way. First, Trump introduced the Remain in Mexico policy, which allowed US authorities to send asylum seekers to Mexico, and asylum seekers had to wait there while their adjudication process was taking place. Now, how did Trump manage to coerce Mexican policymakers to accept that? Trump threatened to impose a 25% tariff on all Mexican imports. Trump continued this strategy, or this type of strategy, when COVID broke out. And he did so by introducing Title 42, which allowed the government to swiftly deport migrants without even allowing them the possibility to ask for asylum. US efforts to offshore migration control to Mexico have increased dramatically the dangers and human rights abuses refugees face. As crossing Mexico became harder, Central Americans came to traverse through more dangerous terrains and to depend on smugglers to cross them. The hazards they faced, their lack of documentation, and their obvious reluctance to ask for help from Mexican officials subjected them to exponentially more violence. They were regularly robbed, sexually assaulted, and even killed. Just to give you an example, by 2016, most Central American women who were about to start the journey would take birth control before ever setting out because they knew that the likelihood that they would be raped was so high. Corruption in Mexico also increased. To be able to cross the country, transmigrants had to pay mordidas or bribes to state officials, including to migration authorities, to the state and federal police, and to members of the army. They also had to pay bribes to everyday citizens, For instance, bus drivers would charge them more. They had to pay for them. And most dangerous of all, trans migrants had to pay gangs and cartels. In 2010, the bodies of 72 Central Americans who had refused to pay such extortion fees to a criminal ring were found in one of the largest mass graves. Similarly, the Remain in Mexico policy in Title 42 also dramatically increased the human rights violations against Central American migrants and other migrants by now, including Haitians. Those who sought asylum in the United States often waited in tent camps in northern Mexico, where murder, rape, and torture and kidnapping occurred regularly. Last week, Title 42 finally came to an end. But America's efforts to offshore migration to Mexico remain intact. Indeed, right before the law came to an end, the Mexican government agreed to Biden's demand that it increase its efforts to apprehend trans migrants and accept 30,000 of all those that the United States deported. The United States has tried and tested the strategy of offshoring migration control since the 1980s. If the goal was to stop most non-Mexican migrants from reaching the United States, it failed. Over the years, transmigration has increased dramatically. As of today, encounters with migrants at the border are at records high. And of course, the strategy has come at tremendously high costs. By trying to curtail transmigration, Mexico saw two of its biggest problems increase dramatically: violence and corruption. And worst of all, there were the horrific abuses trans migrants came to face. Since 2014, migrants, activists have come to denounce all of Mexico, not just as a buffer zone, but have decried it as Mexico is a migrant cemetery. It is time to end this inhumane strategy. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for allowing me to participate in this wonderful dialogue. And I just want to commend Stanford and the State of the West Symposium that's being put on today as such important to adding to this conversation and this dialogue. It's such an important venue here today and such an important subject. You know, as a former legislator, I always thought it would be important that if we work on passing laws, that those laws do specifically what we're trying to accomplish, that they be transparent and that they succeed at solving whatever social problem that law is trying to accomplish. And if it doesn't, there's no use for it. And it's always good to look at history and how our country has sought to create laws to achieve certain goals and whether they achieve them or not. And when it comes to immigration, the U.S. has an enormous body of work in immigration, and there's much to analyze and much to look at. And can we learn from the past as to whether these laws are helpful in achieving whatever the objectives we're trying to achieve? If you consider that between 1783 and 2019, 86 million people came into the country. We're looking at a pretty large swath of time. 86 million immigrants have entered the U.S. We can all say that all of us that were born in the U.S. somehow are part of that diaspora, that we may have someone in our history that was part of those 86 million that entered the United States. The first immigration law that was passed in the United States was right around the time the country was born. In 1790, the first legislation was passed, and it was designed specifically to allow free white persons to become citizens of the U.S., and we're talking about immigrants coming into the country. Only free white persons could become. And that was designed to do two things: to prevent people of African origin, which at the time were slaves, and Native Americans from ever gaining U.S. citizenship. And you could think how kind of odd that is, that a people and a nation that were already inhabitants of America were denied U.S. citizenship. And of course, during that time saw enormous growth in the slave population that made people nervous, and they wanted to take action on that. And if you think about what happened there in our history, what ended up happening in that process where Native Americans were denied citizenship, and outright the laws that followed that included genocide for many tribes in America, it's interesting to note that that law from 1790 stood in place until 1924, which is the first date Native Americans could consider themselves Americans. And following that, they still could not practice their language or their culture. They were denied by statute in practicing their culture, their religion, and their language until that law remained in place until 1978. So it wasn't until 1978 in America that Native Americans could practice their culture and their language. Think about if borders are designed to protect the people within them, the cultures, the nations, the safety. The borders of America did not protect this important nation of people, the Native Americans, and with all their cultures. And to this day, the government is still spending money on trying to recover that culture. That may not be possible now. A lot of languages have lost, a lot of tribes have been lost, a lot have been exterminated. And the cost of that to taxpayers, to our economy, to our society, is probably not even measurable. As for the slaves, they remained uncitizens even after the 14th Amendment passed in through their emancipation in 1864. They were not allowed to be considered citizens. They achieved the vote through the 14th Amendment in 1968 before they actually got their citizenship in 1870. And we know kind of how that went in our history, all the way through the civil rights and the tremendous damage that caused. If you consider that first law in 1790 created an enormous impact on what could one day turn the country into a civil war that led to the deaths of 620,000 soldiers that fought in that civil war, basically to pay for the price of that law. And these were the children of and the grandchildren of the people that may put these laws into effect. In America, we didn't start really regulating Latin Americans entering the country until 1965. That was mentioned. So literally before 1965, as my father had entered in 1949, he entered legally, went to the border, asked for a permit to enter. They gave it to him immediately. He came into the country, worked legally, and decided he liked it. He said, I'm going to stay. In 1953, he applied for citizenship and got it immediately. It wasn't until 1965 that changed. I say this generally from my perspective as a legislator. When I got elected to California, there were a lot of laws that were passed during the 1990s. And when you consider Ronald Reagan was the governor of California, became the president, and got elected and said, you know what, I'm going to do something to address the amount of immigrants in the country. And through Simpson Rodino in 1986 created what was a pretty large process of approving about 60,000 undocumented immigrants were now legal in the U.S. And he put in some laws in there saying, this will be the end for now, for in the future. Now companies need to regulate this and report to the government and not be able to hire anybody. So there was a combination of laws that he put in. But following that, even after that, an additional 5 million people came into the country following that. So it is estimated approximately that the population grew in the United States from 5 million undocumented immigrants in 1986 to 11.1 million in 2013. So that law didn't specifically accomplish that. But following Ronald Reagan, in a state like California that was a red state, and I mean that in terms of prior to Reagan, there was only probably 2 or 3 Democratic governors since the beginning of the state. This was very clearly a red state. And following Reagan, by admitting more immigrants, I think there were a lot of people that got their citizenship thanks to him and were very strong supporters. It wasn't really till Pete Wilson came in and introduced kind of a slurry of anti-immigrant laws in California, several, including Proposition 189, and there were just quite a bit that mobilized the Latino Hispanic community in California to work against him. And that was the seed that was planted in California that made a lot of Latinos move over to the Democratic Party, and that has since made California a pretty solid blue state. And I think Latinos, if you look at their voter registration, they are overwhelmingly Democratic and have contributed to really solidify the Democratic Party's presence. So his attempt to eliminate immigrants from coming into California really backfired in that regard. And when I got elected, we looked at a whole, not only could we look at the laws that were put into place in that year, but we also had a lot of data to go back and see how did these laws perform. One of the laws that he passed was denying immigrants a driver's license. The data that followed that showed that following that legislation, accidents in California rose significantly, and accidents between uninsured motorists increased significantly. And who were the victims of those accidents? Largely people that generally knew how to drive and had insurance, by a driver that didn't know how to drive and did not have insurance. And those were one of the laws that we sought to change. Prior to that law being passed, we couldn't find any evidence of voter fraud, and we couldn't find any change in whatever voter fraud was not or was reported following that. So really the intent of that law to reduce voter fraud in exchange resulted in increasing the amount of accidents. There were many more laws that resulted from this. And I'll just wrap up by saying what we're seeing come out of Texas, the strong stance against immigration, closing borders, is hurting the state of Texas. The same governor of Texas said that he has spent $1 billion in deporting immigrants, $1 billion that could have gone to education, and denying the children of immigrants their birth certificate has not been necessarily productive for Texas. And in California, what we've been doing, including yesterday, the UC regents announced that they believe that they're excluded from a lot of federal policies, and they've decided to hire undocumented immigrants to work for the UC system because they see value in that. I have witnessed that in just working in California, saying, look, California, I mean, we're gonna treat all our residents as people of California and provide them driver's license and health care and jobs and opportunities within our schools. If we're required by the federal government to educate them, let's educate them, and let's make them positive, contributing members of our society. And I'm very proud of the fact that this is creating a better environment in California, a better economy. I think there's a lot to say that California's economy as the 5th largest in the world, and our growth has a lot to do with the way we treat our immigrants and how we incorporate them into our economy. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias. It's great to be here. I want to start by thanking the organizers of the State of the West Symposium. Blas, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be among friends. And it's great to share with you some comments about my experience, what I have seen during the last 4 years that I have had the pleasure of being and the privilege of being the Consul General of Mexico in San Diego. So let me start. Let me see if this works. Yes. I am the Consul General of Mexico in San Diego. This is one of 52 consulates all around the United States. In this room, there are 2 Consul Generals because I am joined, or there we were 2 Consul Generals. Alejandra Bologna is there, the Consul General of Mexico in San Jose. We are the largest consular network of a country in another, and that's a result of the size of our diaspora. There are approximately 37 million people in this country, 37 million people of Mexican origin. A little bit more than 11.5 million of those were born in Mexico. So it's a huge diaspora. And that's why, as part of our diplomatic history, we have had a strong network of consulates throughout the United States, and now number 52. And for each one of them, our main responsibility is to protect the rights and promote the interests of our nationals living within our respective consular jurisdictions. And we not only do that, we also promote the image of Mexico, the prestige of Mexico. We promote cultural programs, community organization programs, economic promotion programs. But our main mandate is to protect the interests of Mexican nationals in our jurisdictions. A little about me. I am a career diplomat, like Alejandra. I've been in this business for 36 years. And my whole career has been in the United States. Previously, I was Consul General of Mexico in Sacramento, and then in Austin, now in San Diego. And soon, if the Senate ratifies me, I'll be moving to Los Angeles. I want to talk about the last 4 years first. I've been in San Diego for 4 years, and I think that it's a good opportunity to review what has happened, what have I seen, which is new, which I did not expect when I arrived there. At the risk of saying the obvious, I think that the most important change that has happened in the border is that most people are trying to enter into the United States under the auspices of administrative immigration law of this country. 10 years ago, 8 years ago, most people try to sneak in between ports of entry. Many Mexicans do still try to sneak in through the mountains and through deserts, particularly those who have some background with immigration and know that there is no way for them to get asylum. But the vast majority of migrants that come today to the United States, they deliver themselves to authorities and they claim asylum. That's a significant change, as it is the fact that now there are many other countries of origin for these immigrants. Last week, the week before the end of Title 42, we visited the border. That's where we did that picture at the beginning of my presentation. There were 80 nationalities of people waiting at the border for the CBP and Border Patrol to pick them up. 80 nationalities. All countries of Africa had immigrants down there waiting for that opportunity to cross. That's a significant change. Another new development, at least for me, is that Mexico has become a land of refugees. There is a very significant increase in terms of people applying for asylum. In 2021, 130,000 immigrants from all over the world, but mostly from Central America and the Caribbean, requested asylum in Mexico. That's a record for us. In 2022, there were 108,000 applicants. We are one of the top countries in terms of hosting refugees throughout the world. Now, the question is, do they want to stay in Mexico? Clearly, the vast majority of people who cross our border want to be here, refugees. They don't want to stay in Mexico. They perhaps stay for a while, and then they will eventually come to the US. A third development is that there is a growing presence of NGOs and international organizations. That's something that I didn't see before, and now they play a crucial role in sheltering, at least in Tijuana, approximately 7,000 immigrants in shelters, in refugios across the city. And finally, and perhaps this is the most important development, the one that I want to underscore, there's been a very significant increase in the number of people dying in their attempt to cross the border, either dying or being severely injured. Let me talk to you a little bit about that. In an effort to be transparent, we have included in our webpage the whole database of the 4 years I've been Consul General. Last year, there were 42 Mexican nationals dying in their attempts to cross the border. In the previous year, 41, and 2 years ago, 16. The number has increased significantly. 646 during the last 4 years has been severely injured to the extent that they have had to go to the hospital system in San Diego or have unfortunately lost their lives in their attempt. All the injuries that we are seeing, 80% of them are wall-related injuries. What we see is empirical evidence that shows that higher walls have not been able to stop or divert the flows of migrants, but have clearly increased the severity of injuries and deaths. And there is a particular point in history that we can signal as a source for this change, and that is the 2018 decision to raise the wall up to 30 feet. There's empirical evidence that shows that the number of injured patients being treated in San Diego went up 5 times after the wall was raised up to 30 feet. Now, I will end up by telling you what do I expect into the next 4 years, into the future, now that we are starting a post-Title 42 regime. Well, the first point is Mexico will still have to respond with a human rights perspective to unilateral decisions taken by the US government. I would frame it a little bit different from how Anna frames the problem. It is not that we come and we negotiate and we agree and we say, let's stop them and use Mexico as a buffer state. It's more like, okay, the US is changing its immigration policies. what do we need to do in order to preserve our interests and in order to protect the human rights of immigrants, either Mexican nationals or not, that are going to be affected. And we can talk about that in greater length. In the next 4 years, we will keep on visiting the 16 detention centers that are in San Diego, 7 of them Border Patrol. Every day, as we have done during the last 4 years I've been Consul General, providing assistance to Mexican nationals who are there detained, helping them, place them in contact with their relatives, explaining them about their legal situation and what happens. A new thing that perhaps it's still too soon to tell, CBP-1, this online system that tries to encourage immigrants to apply for asylum from the comfort of their homes, online, instead of coming all the way to the border. That's a good thing, perhaps. We don't know. But it's clearly something that the Mexican government celebrates if it encourages the legal migration of people instead of risking their lives and trying to cross the border. We will see growing collaboration between Mexico and the United States. That I am sure we will see. And we will see the strength in institutionality will predominate. We are going back to the repatriation agreements that existed before Title 42, and we will see new experiments like the ones we saw during the pandemic, in which we were able to bring to the United States, with the support of CBP, 26,000 workers from the maquiladora industry in order to be vaccinated in U.S. territory, despite the fact that the vast majority of them didn't have U.S. visa. I finish with 5 conclusions. The first one, as I said, higher walls do not stop immigration trends. Secondly, these new actors, NGOs and international organizations, these latter ones funded by both the US and Mexican governments, are going to play an increasing role and do part of the job that governments used to do in the past. We need to be, if you work in the business as Alejandra and I work, you will need to be prepared to reinvent your job every few years. Traditionally, we did not talk to asylum seekers. They were asking for international protections from Mexico. We kept our distance. Now that's no longer possible. Most of them are trying to seek asylum. Many of them are Mexicans. And those who are not Mexicans, we need to help them navigate the system to the extent possible, at least in order to protect their human rights and their security. There will be many more challenges into the future that will need very strong collaboration between our two governments, and perhaps the most important lessons that I take from my 4-year experience in San Diego is that you need as consul to build networks way ahead of when you need them. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Carlos, and thank you, Ana, and thank you, Ben, for really insightful presentations. Maybe we can start where you stopped, where in the last minute. So we clearly you present the problems very clearly. Now let's focus on solutions for a second. What do you think about do you have any recommendations that are kind of concrete? And again, if I had an answer, I would not ask you this question. So I don't have a great answer myself. But do we have any concrete recommendations of how to solve this particular crisis on the border right now? A lot of the things that we mentioned are kind of long-term, and clearly that's, but is there anything that we can say about solutions to the current situation? And I'm happy to start with whoever want to.
I'll as a kind of the legislator.
Please.
I want to mention, when I first got elected, I started a select committee in the Assembly and in the Senate that dealt with creating a better relationship with Mexico and reaching out to Mexico and solving problems. A select committee on California-Mexico cooperation. Through that group, we worked to identify problems at the California, Mexico, and worked to solve them. And we got legislators engaged. Some of them, through their involvement, started learning more about what the problems were really about, not simply what they seemed to be about. And when I started that committee, I learned that not only was it the first one that had ever been created in California, but the first one that was created in the United States, and is still the only one that exists in the United States. If immigration is such a big issue in America, why don't legislatures take an interest in using their power to solve these problems? I learned that there is, in Congress, that has existed for many years, the U.S.-Mexico Interparliamentary Group that has existed. But if you look at the group and see their work, you scarcely really can't find much work. And when you see their budget, it's $60,000 for the Senate, $60,000 for the representatives. $60,000 for a country the size of the United States of America? The state of California invests more money in our committee than the whole federal government. My question is, where is the U.S. legislature and the state legislatures on the subject? Because this is really where the conversation begins. This is where we start to form policy. This is where we start to do research and to understand the magnitude of the problems and how to take meaningful action that'll make impacts for many years to come. U.S. immigration law, as you see the history, has largely been reactionary. We see people coming in, what do we do to stop it immediately? That doesn't work, and it has never worked. The question is, how do we do it in a way that achieves our objectives? What are we trying to achieve? And how do we get to good public policy? We need to invest time and effort and do a little bit of research and get the legislators out into these countries, out into analyzing the results. We need to make laws that are based on science, that are based on getting to the root of a problem. And to do that, we need studies, but we need the involvement. So whenever you see a senator kind of grilling a representative saying, how come you're not doing this and how come you're not doing that? And you know, I want to encourage people to kind of respond, well, you're a legislator, what are you doing? And if it's really that important, what resources are you applying to this? And I think this is, all of us as a country, we should really look at this and say, why aren't our legislators doing that? Texas invests zero in this. If this is really causing them to invest $1 billion a year in policing and evicting immigrants, why aren't they taking a more meaningful approach in spending that money more wisely to get better results? Same with Florida, and they're the states that have actually started to violate U.S. law. And while they're telling immigrants that they need to respect the law, they're busing immigrants to the state of Democratic-run states. I don't know if that really is a solution. I don't know what it accomplishes, but it does. I say it adds fuel to the fire, and it doesn't solve a thing.
Anna.
Well, thanks for that question. First, despite my consul's and I's disagreement, I think part of the reason that it's easy to offshore migration control to Mexico is because their human rights abuses are invisible. Let's think about it. A detention center just burned in Mexico. How many protests were there here in the United States? Almost none. What did the Remain in Mexico policy do? Well, children were exempt from it. So Central American and other parents would send their children alone while they stayed in northern Mexico. Advocates who had fought against Trump's family separation policies said that the Remain in Mexico policy was further contributing to family separation. It was family separation in another name. So the first thing and most important thing that I think needs to happen is attention, advocacy around what happens not just in the United States, but in other countries. Now, in terms of US law, which I think is at the moment extremely hard to change, so when you set short-term solutions, this is not one, but I still want to mention it. As a historian, we've been talking about 1965 nonstop. The law of 1965 was passed by two congresspeople, Hart and Saller. They were both Democrats. Now, before passing this law, Philip Hart, who was a Michigan Democrat, had suggested a completely different law. He had suggested that, yes, there be a cap on the number of immigrants allowed in the United States. But unlike now, when only that cap is divided by each country having a 7% proportion of that cap, it'd be divided in this way. 20% of all visas would go to refugees. 32% would go to countries in proportion of their populations, so that, for example, New Zealand doesn't have as much opportunity to come, which is a much smaller country than Mexico, and 48% to countries in proportion to the amount of emigration that it had seen in the last 15 years. And this was, of course, important because migrants have families and communities here. So if they've been coming, it's only fair to allow them to continue coming. And it's also a way to reduce undocumented migration.
I'm a diplomat, so I am going to recommend my government, and perhaps that way we'll make clear some of the issues that I might not agree entirely with Anna, who's a friend from many years, by the way. It's very frustrating, for me at least, to see how we Mexicans have been unable to speak in terms of interests instead of rights. Every time we talk about immigration in Mexico, if you read the papers in Mexico, everything is the rights, the human rights, the rights of people to migrate, the rights to blah, 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 blah. Nobody in Mexico, no public figure, is capable of talking about what's the interest of Mexico in terms of immigration. I learned from my friend Dimitri Papadimitri, who many of you, I'm sure, knew, that immigration is a public good. And as a public good, in democracies, you have to administer it in an open and transparent way. We have not learned to do that in Mexico. There are hard truths that we need to face in front of public opinion. We don't want to talk about that in Mexico because of our experience with the United States, because we are used to see ourselves as país de migración, an emigration country. But we are quickly becoming an immigration country. And we are not capable of presenting to our own public opinion the issue of immigration as a public good that needs to be administered, where government will do so in a democratic and transparent way, and in which necessarily there will be winners and losers. And there are certain hard truths that we don't know how to speak to the government or to public opinion in Mexico. The first hard truth that we don't want to talk is that we need to control our borders. Another hard truth that we don't want to talk is that we need labor. We need skilled immigrants. We need unskilled immigrants, quote unquote, unskilled immigrants as well. I look with envy our friends in Canada that are very capable of saying, this is what we need, this is what our economy needs. Let's try to encourage this type of immigration. And that has nothing to do with respecting human rights of immigrants in Mexico. I'm telling you, we are becoming a country of destination for thousands of refugees. The problem that we have is that refugees see us as un escaloncito, as a stepping, how to say, stone, as a stepping stone. They want to come to the US. Not even the people from Haiti, Haiti, I don't know how to say it in English, Haiti, Haiti.
Haitians, Haiti,
Haitians,
Haiti.
not even Haitians. They stay in Tijuana 4 or 5 years, and as soon as they see an opportunity, many of them, not all, they cross to the United States. We are competing with the largest economy in the world for talent. So I think that a thing I don't like about part of your analysis is that, to me, it's very simplistic to see whatever we do as a response to US pressure. Perhaps it's our fault because we don't know how to explain this openly and publicly. But let me tell you, and I finish with this, with a very specific example. During the last 2 years, migrants coming to the US seeking asylum from Eastern Europe, Russians mostly and former Soviet republics, used to come to the border in San Isidro driving their cars. And they just, a la brava, they try to cross. And they use the ready and the sentry lanes, the lanes that are for frequent and trusted travelers. Every time that happened, the whole port had to stop and delays increased, time delays increased. When our friends from CBP asked yours truly to do something and try to encourage a filter on the Mexican side, and they asked me that once I asked them for more vaccines during the pandemic for children because there were not enough vaccines for children in Mexico. They said, okay, we would be able to talk about a new program for vaccines for children as long as you are able to help us 100 meters before the borderline to stop Eastern European migrants who are willing to cross the border, abandon their car, but once they are on the US side, ask for asylum. And I said, forget about the vaccines. It's crazy. That's like, if I touch that rail, I'll be there. But the problem worsened over the next 2 years. And it took at least 1 year for us to get the coalition of Mexican agencies that involve the Guardia Nacional, the Tijuana police, the state government, to partner among themselves and do establish a filter on the Mexican side, 100 meters before the borderline, at least to stop those cars from coming all the way. Because that was the only possible way that CBP would send some of their agents that had to be on the borderline to send them back to the booths and then reduce waiting times for everybody. 70% of the people who cross south to north in San Isidro are frequent travelers. They have ready or sentry lanes. So we were protecting the common infrastructure in Mexico, the infrastructure, the border infrastructure that we share. As you may imagine, when this was made public, the only spokesperson that was designed to talk about this was me, and I was heavily criticized because I was doing the dirty job to the gringos, right? It was very difficult for me and for all of us to explain to the population of Tijuana and Baja California that it was in the interest of everybody, both Americans and Mexicans, to protect the common infrastructure.
Yes, so maybe I'll follow up with a question again to all of you. So you started to talk about Mexico and its role. So can you talk a little bit more about whether and how you view Mexico's role in, like helping address some of these challenges? Of course, on the one hand, Mexico is in a tough situation. On the one hand, there is a humanitarian crisis. People, are not just moving because they want to earn $1 more. They are facing really severe situations, and they kind of want to move to better opportunity for them and their family in the U.S. On the other hand, you mentioned, a country has a right to enforce the law and and so on. So how do you view, in general, does Mexico have? Is it all mostly U.S. have to change its policy, or do you view Mexico has some role in this? And maybe, I don't know, we can start with Ana maybe, or if you want to, or.
Well, like I've said, I actually disagree that Mexico should close its borders, like you said earlier, or take its interest that way into consideration. And we can see about how it has implemented its interests in the past with Central Americans. In the civil wars, when Central Americans were crossing first to Mexico, long before they started coming to the United States in such high numbers, Mexico created tent camps for them in Chiapas and then in Quintana Roo. And what happened? Well, they allowed the army from Guatemala that had been killing people to come into Mexico and kill some of the most active refugees. It deported, just as the United States is doing now, refugees to an area that they would surely be killed, which is a complete violation of human rights agreements. So I think that Mexico does have to look at its own interest, but in a more global context, especially given how much Mexico has advocated for Mexicans' migration to the United States. And that's something else I want to address, is when Mexico advocates for its own people to be able to come to the United States, rather than creating proper infrastructure and introducing policy, and at the same time introducing policies historically, such as the Green Revolution and NAFTA, that anyone could say would surely increase migration before they were passed. And no recourse was done. So the Mexican government knew this was going to happen, and yet continued to say that migrants continued to advocate for Mexican migration to the United States. So I wonder, where does this leave Mexican citizens? What does it say that Mexico's own government sees the migration of its citizens to a country where they would be considered illegal as a solution to its economic problems?
Real quick.
I will in 5 minutes open it up for questions from don't worry.
Real quick. I didn't say that Mexico should close its borders. I say that we should explain better why we need to control our borders. The borders should be a filter, not something that would be either closed or open. Secondly, I don't agree that immigration has been a good business for Mexico. And I don't agree that we have been in the business of advocating for more migrants to come to the United States. 20 million people. Think just that number, let that number sink in. 20 million people migrated, left Mexico for good in the last 30 years. It's a huge exodus, huge. And the price of that are hundreds, thousands of ranchitos all over Mexico that are completely abandoned because people migrated with their whole families once it was very difficult to be a sojourner. That's clearly a bad business for us. We gave our bonus, demographic bonus, very generously as a gift to the United States, and it is not recognized as such. In fact, if you see the media right now, it's the other way around. We are the ones who are trying to send, as Trump said, your bad people we send our bad people to Mexico, to the United States. In fact, it's a great loss for us. Now, there are many things that Mexico needs to change. It's embarrassing what Ana was saying. She's completely right. It's embarrassing what happened in Ciudad Juárez. And she can tell 5 examples, and I can tell 15 examples of tragedies in which we have been unable to treat properly migrants from Central America and third countries that are trying to cross our territory. We need to improve our record in that regard. But I would say the Mexican government is proud of the way it has changed very quickly into an immigration country. Today, if you take the decision of becoming a refugee in Mexico, the equivalent of your social security number, the one that here takes years and years and years in order to get a green card, in Mexico takes 4 days. And it is very easy to regularize situation in Mexico. We need labor. The problem is that we are not changing as fast as the context forces us to change.
And if I can just build on what he said about 20 million people come to the United States. And in California, we have seen the immigrants that come from Mexico as a huge benefit in our ability to trade with Mexico, because they understand the system in Mexico, they understand the language, the culture, the laws, and they become very good California businesses that engage in trade with Mexico and help our economy enormously. So, and the way I see it is that could work well for Mexico as well, especially when you consider how much we do trade with Mexico. And we have former Mexicans, now Californians, engaging in that economy and helping to grow that economy. And what does it do? It's helping to create prosperity in Mexico that they haven't had before. And that's why I think NAFTA is so important, because for California, NAFTA has been wonderful in comparison to the rest of the country. And that's partly the reason, because we've been looking at our Mexican immigrants as enormous assets for our economy.
So I have so many more questions that I can ask you, but I think I'm sure many people want to ask questions. So how about we just have a round of questions here? Yes, please.
Hey, thanks a lot. You, Professor Abramitzky, I'm probably mispronouncing it.
You're fine.
Okay. Began this session pointing out the advantages of immigration, which I assume are shared by the entire panel. And we have reviewed the problems of it. So now I want to put you in a hypothetical position. You're president. At the start of your term, you intend to make a major improvement in the U.S.'s immigration system over the next 2 to 4 years. You are also politically fearless. I'll add that. What do you do? How do you start the process and kind of try to go to the specifics and not to a lot of generalizations?
Anybody want to?
Sure. I think, first of all, I would visit the countries that are sending the most amount of immigrants. Currently, some of those countries we have economic embargoes and quite a pretty hurtful laws that are exacerbating the problem. While I don't support necessarily their system of government or the fact that they're sidestepping fair elections, but you engage. I think it's important that you sit down and you start to address the biggest issues. The U.S. has an enormous amount of resources to provide technical assistance to underserved countries. We're letting kind of China go to South America and start to make investments in that area where the U.S. is not. We're leaving South America wide open for China and other international countries. And you look, things like Venezuela could have been prevented with a greater involvement from the U.S. in terms of, and I'm not saying meddling in their business. There's a lot of things that we can do to help undeveloped countries.
Constructive engagement.
I mean, that's got to be part of the United States' long-term strategy to South America. To think that it started in 1820 with the Monroe Doctrine and that somebody dared to dream, look, there's this a wave of independence in the Americas and we're not going to be colonies anymore. And let's start to talk about how we can jointly create our own future together. And what happened with that? Where did it go? And we can go back to that and say, look, we are I mean, we might not do exactly what the European Union is doing, but I mean, why can Europe create a union and encourage a common prosperity within their region? Why can't we do something similar, or look at our countries to the south and say, look, we can develop our economies together. There is benefit in Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico developing a middle class, because the bigger the middle class, the greater opportunity there will be for that middle class to buy American-made products. And let's start engaging. And I really haven't seen that. I really haven't seen that to a great extent. I kind of supported Biden's effort to go down to Guatemala and to, you know, and I saw that there was a beginning there, and I think there needs to be follow-up. There needs to be an ongoing program. Think about, Texas claimed $1 billion in policing, right, for immigrants. The wall that Trump built that really is completely ineffective. Even members of his own party wouldn't vote for it. Remember, Congress never approved the construction of that wall. But $9 billion, think about $10 billion, and whatever else that we're spending on processing immigrants. What is that costing us? And what can we do to that money to invest in a common economy for North and South America? Even if it was just $10 billion, that would be a huge investment in some of these countries. If it's directed to education, if it's directed to starting new businesses, that could make an enormous dent in creating jobs and opportunity in South America, and an opportunity for the U.S. to engage in trade with those countries.
Does anybody else want to?
I would do three things, very specific. One, I would allow for those who have established roots in this country to regularize their situation. The average undocumented Mexicans have spent 13, 14 years living in the shadows in this country. 13, 14 years. So they need to have a chance to become legal residents. Not all, at least the ones who have established roots. Secondly, we need to recreate temporary worker programs that would allow for the workers to come, work 6 months, 7 months, and then go back. Create again the sojourner model, in which the family stays in Mexico and doesn't have to come to South Central LA to live in a counterculture type of environment. It's not easy. Just like regularization would not be easy, in the case of temporary worker programs, there's a strong opposition from many Latino groups who are traditionally our allies. We would have to work with them. But at least the Mexican government has changed its approach to this. We used to avoid talking about temporary worker programs. Now you can listen and you can more clearly listen to Mexican decision makers advocate for programs such as H2A, which currently brings 300,000 Mexicans to do temporary agricultural work to the US and in a safe, secure, and legal way. And thirdly, what you were saying in terms of investing in the regions that are sending migrants north, particularly El Triángulo del Norte, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, as well as Chiapas, Guerrero, and Oaxaca. Those are the Mexican states that are the #1 origin of migrants last year, the previous year, the previous year, for many years. The southern part of Mexico has been the one, and Michoacán has been the source of migrants towards this region. The President of Mexico has made this a priority, and most of our international cooperation programs have been devoted to those countries. Perhaps too soon to tell about its impact, but it's been a very significant investment. From the very beginning, President López Obrador asked first President Trump, then President Biden, to do it jointly and to invest significant funds there. Hopefully, eventually, we will be able to do it in a more regional approach.
And I feel like you have a couple of things to say.
I do. First, I want to say that I completely agree with legalization. I agree that this is a transnational problem. We need transnational solutions. That being said, when we're thinking about how to invest in Mexico and about US intervention in Central America, I would be very careful about how we go about doing that. For example, in the 1940s, the United States invested heavily in Mexico's Green Revolution. The Green Revolution then led to massive migration. The United States supported the civil wars in Central America. Those civil wars have only propelled Central American migration. So yes, I think that the only way that we're going to curb this problem is by funding and implementing, reducing unemployment, violence, and corruption in those areas. But how we go about it needs to be in very careful ways and very well thought out. I would not implement an H-2A program. I would not continue to increase it. Current scholarship describes H-2As and H-2B programs to be akin to slavery. H-2A workers, like braceros, are guest workers who can come to the United States for short periods of time and then return. The problem is that when they come to the United States, they cannot unionize, and if they, quote unquote, misbehave according to the employers, they're blacklisted, and as such, they're not allowed to return back to the United States. They're blacklisted by employers themselves. What does this mean? People want to join the H-2A and H-2B programs because they want exactly what you suggested, to be able to come and go between Mexico and the United States. People have wives and children in the United States. They don't want to just leave them. They have mothers who will die soon. If they come to the United States without papers, knowing how hard it is to cross the border back south and then come back north, they just stay in the United States. They don't see their family members, sometimes for 20 years, sometimes for more. The H-2A and H-2B program allows them to come and go. But as a result, the exploitation in these programs has been dramatic. So I would be very careful. I would also be very careful in implementing a program where people can come and go and are only seen as workers and not as people who could eventually join and become and truly belong in our society.
And I've done a lot. I represented a very heavily agricultural district, and in working with some of the not only with the immigrant community but the farmers, one of the things that the farmers like about the HBA is that they can bring back the same workers I found generally in working with them that they have workers that come in at 6 months and go in 6 months, so they come in 6 at a time, but they work with the same workers because those workers they develop good relationships with. And I'm sure there are abuses, and those abuses could be resolved, but also let's not eliminate something that's kind of working for both sides, because those workers return because they not only get the pay that's associated with those jobs is pretty high in terms of in comparison to Mexico or wherever they come from, whatever country. The wages that they pay for it's right now, farmers are paying about $19 for wages and have to provide housing and transportation for the workers. And they bring over the abuses, I imagine, could be solved. And what I've seen also is that those workers come and learn new techniques, whether it is in farming or other areas, and then they go back and they're able to employ that knowledge that they gain in their own communities and establishing businesses. I've seen that. I'm not a big fan of maquiladoras in Mexico, but they're bringing in people from Germany, Japan, Korea, teaching workers new techniques, new skills that I think are very useful for those employees in the Mexican economy. And I think they're going to be the future entrepreneurs of Mexico as they go through that training. Again, it's hard to find perfect systems that work, but we have to be open to concepts that help resolve. I mean, I would rather do HBA than having somebody live here undocumented in the country for 20 years and not see their family. At least they can go back if they decide after 3 months, after 6 months, but not be kind of completely isolated from their families in the U.S. for 20.
But
you know,
workers do say that undocumented workers say that they face less exploitation at the work site than H-2A and H-2B workers. Because A, they can move employers, B, they can unionize. You know, when you're not attached to an employer, it's much easier to demand or to go if you're not being treated properly.
And
So
I had never heard of that, and I'm not denying it, but I think those are things that can be addressed within the program.
All right, so I guess our time is almost coming to an end. So I'm suggesting we'll take let's collect 2 or 3 questions, and each of you will have the last. You'll choose a question and have the last word. But Ben, go ahead. You can give people that.
One quick question: why can't we talk more about the bright spot story of El Salvador? They changed their leadership. We've had people who have worked with us and said the country has totally now become a destination site for enjoyment. The people are staying there. The crime rate has gone down. And the leadership there of Asian descent has done a phenomenal job and is getting high ratings. So I'm just saying I like to hear bright spot stories as well as honest, trusted, negative stories. But I think there's a great story out of El Salvador. People are no longer migrating out. They're staying. The education level's raising. And the people in this country who migrated from El Salvador are going home now and enjoying their opportunity of going home.
Okay. Ben, can you ask Kelsey? Kelsey, I think she's having her hand up.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Kelsey. I'm an undergraduate here studying international relations and human rights. My question is, what steps is Mexico taking or should it take to address corruption and violence, especially in border towns like Tijuana that have had thousands of homicides, 2,000 in Tijuana in the last year, and also considering that you mentioned a few of the out immigration Mexican states that are on the State Department do not travel, and so what is Mexico doing or should it do to address the violence that is driving people to the border in the first place?
So look, I realize we are not going to have time to take all the questions, but our speakers will graciously stay with us afterwards so that you can come and ask your questions. But I'll ask you maybe to very briefly maybe choose a question and just say a couple words, but short. Yeah.
Short, yes. I'm not familiar with El Salvador experience. What I can tell you is that we are not that unlike the U.S. in terms of being an open, plural, and democratic society. And I don't think that some of the reforms that I have heard have happened in El Salvador, which I'm not an expert of, would go well in an open and plural society like in Mexico. Secondly, I think that it is clear what we need to do. We need to rebuild institutions from the ground up at a very basic level. That involves police, that involves prosecutors, that involves judges, and it involves detention centers. It's not going to be a clear progressive line that only goes better and better and better and better. It will take like a roller coaster, going up, going down. Sometimes it seems that we go a step back and then move 2 steps further. But it's the only way that a democratic and open society could solve the organized crime that we are facing. I do believe that the Mexican state is too strong not to impose its force in order to impose the rule of law in those regions that you are talking about. However, we need to do it in a way that is, again, in accordance to our democratic institutions and with due respect to human rights.
So we are at 5:01, but I'll let Anna and last word, Anna. Yeah.
Well, when it comes to El Salvador, even as we think of places where migration has fallen, as we look to the future, I want to say there is something that all of us have ignored in this panel that is catastrophic, and that is climate change. And migration is going to continue and going to increase dramatically because of migrant change, because of climate change, no matter what political system has changed. So that is something that we need to look toward or really think about how we're going to address.
Short sentence, if you want.
I just want to thank everybody for inviting me to this wonderful discussion. I don't know about you guys, but this was a wonderful experience for me, and getting to listen to Ana and Carlos talk about these issues was extremely amazing. So
great. So let's join us in the thank you,
Yeah.
Annalise. And just 1 second before we leave, I wanna first thank CIPR for hosting this wonderful event, and I wanna let's welcome David with who put all of this together, and thank him, and he will have the last word.
wow, this is good.
I understand that I'm standing between you and drinks outside, so I'm going to be brief, but I have to say I can't resist, as an historian and as the son of an immigrant, adding a couple of words about the discussion we just heard. We have a deep national mythology about immigration to this country, and most of us have grown up having internalized that mythology. But let me just remind you of a couple of lesser-known facts. 100 years ago, the United States was the destination for a little over 40% of all international migrants. Today, we're the destination for about 20% of all international migrants, and that's one of many new factors in the situation that we're dealing with. We've just heard about some others, that countries like Mexico, which historically sent people abroad, are now receiving people. Another country in that category is Italy, which for generations exported people abroad and is now a destination. And in fact, there are now more transnational migrants living in Europe than in the United States. So this is not just a question that affects our national history and our current circumstance. It's a global phenomenon, as Anna has reminded us, and it's going to happen a long time. Second little known fact, of the great wave of migrants that came here between the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 and the outbreak of World War I in 1914, roughly a century, roughly 36 million immigrants, most of them from Europe. Little known fact about that great migration, about 44% of those people eventually went home to live. This is lost to our national memory because our national mythology tells us that everybody cast their patrimony, cultural patrimony, over the side of the ship as the ship came into New York Harbor, and that was that. It's not true. And this reminds me, when I think about that 44% who eventually repatriated, that here's a thought experiment. In the current situation, what if we tried to think about our circumstance not in the framework of immigration as we traditionally understand it, but as we've heard repeatedly on this panel, as a refugee crisis? It seems to me we cannot automatically assume that all the refugees knocking on the door at our southern border really intend long-term to stay in this country. Some undoubtedly do. But here's an unknown, known, and maybe a subject for research. What are the ultimate intentions of those people now trying to get into the country? My guess is that a lot of them would be very happy someday to go home again, and if the circumstances in their countries of origin change. So I think we need to reframe the discussion nationally and think outside the framework of our traditional understanding of immigration. And no gathering of this sort is complete without quoting Abraham Lincoln. So I'm going to close on that note. In an address to Congress in 1862, he said, "The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country." So I think we need some fresh thinking about this crisis, whether it's an immigration crisis as traditionally understood or a refugee crisis, but I think we need some bold new thinking. I want to thank Mark Duggan and Greg Roston from CIPR, our partners in this enterprise, and Bruce Kane. Bruce, are you still around? Who's the current director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West, and all of our respective staffs who did so much to put this event together. I want to thank all the panelists who've spoken today, and I invite you all to join us outside for a concluding drink. Thank you all for being here.